Welcome to the Agile on the Mind podcast, where we discuss how to build intelligent teams inspired by agility and the world of cognitive science. If you're listening to this podcast, there's a good chance you'll enjoy the Agile on the Mind Substack. To receive a free weekly newsletter with explorations of agility and cognitive science, complete with tools, tips and tricks, go to agileonthemind.substack.com. This week's episode is sponsored by me and my tiny agile consultancy, Embodied Agility. Embodied Agility helps your teams collaborate better by providing training, coaching and mentoring for your leaders and teams. And I appreciate the cringeness of me sponsoring my own tiny podcast with my own tiny consultancy. But the upshot is, if you enjoy listening to me talk here, you might want me to come work with you, and I'm available. So wherever your organization is in its life cycle, from startup to supergiant, better collaboration helps you build better products, quicker, cheaper and easier. And Embodied Agility is here to help. To book a free 1-hour coaching and exploration session, go to embodiedagility.co.uk. This week's guest is Laura Stroud. Laura is an author, a ghostwriter, and a doctoral student at the University of Derby. She's the founder of the Derbyshire Writing School, and Laura is passionate about opening up the world of creative writing for beginners. And through her courses, retreats, and workshops, she makes writing feel joyful. Laura is an Associate Fellow of the Higher Education Academy and has worked as a lecturer and a program leader for the MA Creative Writing at the University of Derby. Welcome, Laura.
Hi, Daniel. Thank you for having me.
It's good to have you. Laura, what is creative writing?
Okay, let's just start at the beginning, shall we, and get right in there. So what is creative writing? Well, to me, I love simple definitions, things that are really easy to understand. We can then build on it and explore. So when I think about creative writing in its simplest form, it is emptying the words from your head and putting them on the page. But often we want more than that. So we think of creative writing as something that's expressive, a way to share ideas, to share who we are. But it's also about using words creatively. So that starts off with a nice simple definition. It's just writing really that shows imagination.
So what led you into the world of creative writing?
I have always loved to read, but I didn't really think that I could write a book. I didn't really think writing was a way that you could earn money or have a job. So it was just something I did as fun on the side. I started maybe in my mid-20s just blogging, journaling. That's where I began, just trying to... Actually, wait, can I start all of this again?
Yeah, 100%.
Thanks, Daniel.
That's the value of us being a podcast,
Yeah.
a radio program.
I'm going to start that again. What led me to creative writing? And why I want to start this question again, you can leave all of this in, that's fine, is because lots of people say, I always dreamed of wanting to be a writer when I was younger. And that really wasn't me. That was not how I got started in all of this. I was working for actually the University of Derby, and I had worked there since 2014 and had been there for about 5 or 6 years. It was one of those jobs that I'd got after university. I'd done lots of, Daniel, I'm making such a mess of this. I don't know why it's really hard to explain the origin story of how I got started, but it's like everything, isn't it? It's so intertwined into the things that we've experienced that actually when you begin to unpick it, it is a mess. How did this start?
There's not a linear path, is there? It's like, well, this inspiration here and this happened and I happen to be in this place and this day. So which cause is the most important one?
Yeah. So,
well, let's say, like, what excites you about creative writing now?
Yeah. Okay. What started me is this idea of documenting my life through stories. That's at the heart of it. I had done lots of traveling. I'd had experienced many different versions of a gap year. And the further I got away from those experiences, the less I remembered them in detail. You can look at pictures and that brings back a story or a moment, but it was the actual events that were beginning to disintegrate. They were losing clarity. So I wanted to document my life via stories so I could reminisce, but also reflect and figure out what I learned because of those experiences, how they made me who I am today, and also just so I could keep them forever, so I could save them somewhere, not just a picture, but an actual description of who I was then, how it made me feel, what I learned, and I could continually revisit that. So it began with blogging. I started a blog That's how my writing started, sharing all of these crazy, cringy things with the world. And that developed into this idea of, oh, I would love to do this for a living. I would love to write for a living. And this is where the story gets messy. I was working in lots of different jobs and I was not feeling fully fulfilled. I had, senior management jobs and was doing things that I enjoyed, but I always had this secret wish to earn a living from my writing, to work for myself. So 2019 came and I thought, that's it, I'm going to pack my job in and I'm going to go back to university and study an MA in creative writing. My goal here was mainly just to have time to write. So yes, study and learn, but there's that incredible gift that we have when we go back to university. Is for me, it was time, because I couldn't make everything work while I was working full time. I couldn't have this side hustle that I was trying to build and commit to my job and all of these things. So I decided to throw it up in the air, give myself a year to figure out how to build a business, to figure out how to make my writing work, to write a novel, to study an MA, all of these things, thinking like, yeah, I can do that in a year, why not? And then, of course, March 2020 came and everything just crumbled to the floor. And I thought, what on earth am I going to do? All these doors kept shutting and I didn't understand how I could make this dream work. So I went back to the idea of, well, why did I care about creative writing? Why did I get started? This idea of documenting our life through stories, and actually my passion of wanting to help other people do the same thing. So I decided, okay, I'm going to start a writing school. I dragged my dad on board as well. He's a writer, and I thought, come on, let's do this together. And we formed Derbyshire Writing School. And what I feel was unique about this was it's a place for people who don't see themselves as writers. So you don't have to have studied English. You don't have to know all of the wonderful grammar rules. You can break them. You don't have to have gone back to university to complete an MA in creative writing. You just have to want to document your life, to have something to say, to have something to share, and to want to do that in a creative way. So that was the ethos behind Derbyshire Writing School. And really, my philosophy about creative writing is that anyone can do it. It should be joyful. And we all have something to share and something important to say. And I believe that we need to document that and save it. So that was a really messy introduction. And I do apologize. I just fall into pieces to try and explain to you about this thing that I love. But hopefully it gives you a bit of an idea of what creative writing is to me and where it's come from.
I think maybe it shows something about the writing process, that these things don't just come out perfectly formed first time. You give a first approximation, and I'm probably going to want to keep this in the final edit because it's interesting. Like the first draft, and you're like, that doesn't make any sense. Let's try again. And then you go back to the second one. You're like, okay, by the time we get to the third or the fourth one, now I think I'm starting to make sense. And I think that's maybe what can be intimidating to people who don't consider themselves writers. Like, I'm just starting to think about myself as a writer because you encouraged me to publish the first draft of the intro to my book. So the thing that can put us off is that idea of, well, how am I supposed to make my jumbled, crazy thoughts look like these excellent things that I read? And the answer is, well, what's the answer?
The answer is just starting and knowing that you're going to make a mess of it, as I have, and not feeling like you have to have the right answer first time. I mean, I wish I had the answer right the first time, and maybe it's something I should have rehearsed. But when we think about creative writing, actually, it's that messy beginning, which is the most fun part of just getting the ideas down on paper when they don't make sense, because we know that actually through writing we can understand what we think. And clarity in writing is clarity in thought, and clarity in thought is clarity in writing. So the more we can just mess about with this on the page, we can refine it and edit it and sharpen it to get to actually know, this is what I wanted to say, this is how I wanted to share the story. But it's scary when you do that, because we want something to look good first time, don't we? We want to, we're putting time into something when we're writing it down, and it can feel really frustrating when we can't shape the words in the way that we think. And that's where the skill and the challenge is, to really say, okay, this is what I think about this. No, write it this way, change it, edit. No, actually, that isn't what I meant to say. And I think the most fun part about writing is the first draft. And I say this because when you come back to do the edits, when you're doing more edits and more edits, it's really, really hard. So you've got to enjoy that first bit, even though it feels scary and it's messy, because the editing brings a whole new set of challenges. So this first bit has to be where so much joy comes in of, okay, I'm going to be creative, I'm going to try something new, and I'm not going to worry about making mistakes.
So if I'm a person who doesn't consider myself a writer, I'm maybe a software developer or a nurse or I'm trying to think, like, what are the list of careers that they give you? I'm a firefighter. And why should I try creative writing? Why should I explore that avenue? Why should I go to the Derbyshire Writing School?
Okay, so there's a couple of different reasons why you should try writing. And I say this as a lecturer in creative writing and running a writing school. You don't need to actually go to any formal training. You don't have to pay to learn how to write. So much of writing is tacit knowledge. We learn to write by writing. Of course, there's people that can help you and make it easier. And that's what I would try to do to make things easy for you. But you don't have to go on set courses. You don't have to read set books. You can just turn to the page and write the things that are within you. So I just put that as a caveat, because I would hate for anyone to think that you have to have this formal training. I think sometimes that can feel like such an unnecessary barrier and another way to put people off. So that's just a little side note there.
That's one of the nice things about, like, anyone that has a pen or a computer or a phone can do some writing. Okay, so other than there being zero barrier to entry, why would I want to spend my time if I was a firefighter learning?
So as a firefighter in particular, we'll look at some of the emotional well-being elements, let's say. So we know that writing can make us feel better. So if we are writing in an expressive or a reflective way, it can help with our mental well-being. So even just documenting, journaling, which can feel really cringy when you start, but just writing how you feel, what you've experienced, and reflecting on that can give you more peace. People do it before bed, can help them sleep. Emptying these thoughts out onto the page can just be really helpful for our well-being. There's research as well that in particular letter writing is really great for gratitude and increasing our happiness, whether you send these letters or not. So writing to someone in the past who's had a big impact on you and expressing why that was and expressing your gratitude and thanks to them. Maybe even if we're trying to make this more of a work context, thinking about people on your team. So writing letters to them, you don't have to send them. Of course, you could send them, but expressing gratitude for things that they've taught you. Or if you are, I don't know much about firefighting, but I'm thinking that you're going to have a lot of trust as well. So just thinking about how grateful you are that you've got people that are looking out for you. So there's lots of that well-being side to writing, which is really important, as helping us mentally, helping us feel better, feel joyful, thinking about that increase in gratitude it can give us. But there's also more practical things. And I would love to know more about your audience too, so I can try and relate this and help them. That if we think about creative writing in the work context, we think about, okay, so maybe we want a high performing team, or maybe we want to increase psychological safety, which is something I'd love to come on to talk about later. But actually, creative writing, we know, teaches us how to be better communicators. It can really increase our ability to empathize, to be better listeners as well. So when we start to think about some of the skills it teaches us, problem solving is really important within creative writing, being creative and thinking creatively. And the more we engage in creative writing, the more we develop these skills. So actually, we can start to see the links if we explore creative writing in a work context, how that can help us maybe build a stronger team, or just help us with those skills that are really important in the workplace.
Yeah, talking about like understanding who my audience is. I'm like, what does my mum think about creative writing? So both of my audience members are very interested in teamwork, and the pitch of this show is, or this podcast is, bringing together sort of cognitive science and agile teams and trying to build high performing teams like that. So my default starting point when I think of like who might be interested in this is someone making some sort of technology product maybe, or involved in some sort of other teamwork where you're around other people all the time, and there's teamwork is a contact sport and you're very like close and working very tightly with these people, and you've got your own bit of work that you need to do, and there might be pressures on you and things like that. So I'm particularly interested in the problem solving side and the better listener side and the things that help us collaborate better as a team. I was interested, how does creative writing help me become a better listener?
Yeah, okay. So a couple of ways. First of all is actually through active reading. So when we think about creative writing, a huge part of being able to write creatively is to read more and to read like a writer. So when we're reading, we're trying to understand and put ourselves in that person's shoes. Particularly here, I'm talking about nonfiction, life writing, creative nonfiction, which is my area of specialism within creative writing. So that teaches us to be a better listener because we're really trying to understand that person's experience. And although that's through words, oh, it's all through words, but through reading, that can really help us. But more importantly, or more practically, one of the ways creative writing helps us be a better listener is through one of the ways that we teach creative writing. And this is one of the core pedagogic tools that we use, and that's the workshop. And I know that you might use this in the way that you work with teams. So it'd be really interesting to look at the difference and also figure out, well, who came up with it first? Who used, who developed this as a tool first? So in creative writing, we use the workshop as a place for writers to bring writing that they're working on. And in this space, they may stand up terrifyingly and read it in front of everyone and then gain critique and reflection. Or quite often what happens now is work is circulated before the workshop, and then there's this discussion that happens around that work. But when we think about the listening side of it, it's actually giving someone space to share their story and share their words, and actually letting them tell it fully before we then give them feedback. And I think there's something really powerful within that space, letting someone share something that matters to them, even if you don't really care about it, or you might think, actually, it's nothing to do with me. I don't like that style of writing. I'm not interested in that story. Stopping and allowing them to share part of their story, or giving your time to read it and then allowing them to have this discussion time around their work, creates this value for that person. It gives them the space and the knowledge of, hang on, actually, what I have to say or what I think, it does matter. And somebody is willing to stop, give me some time and give me some feedback. And I think that is something really special that happens within creative writing.
So that's a link into psychological safety, right? Like if I know that there is a structure of this creative writing workshop where I will be given, or people will give me a space to read my whole piece and listen actively and pay attention and give me feedback there, that space is mine. And then there's a kind of respect that comes from that. Maybe I can respect my own ideas. I can respect my own process a bit if I know that these people will give me that space. That's my association with it anyway. And then when we're talking about teams collaborating, well, psychological safety is the willingness to take interpersonal risks and things like that in a team, to have an idea that might be wrong or to admit a mistake. And yeah, I can imagine if you're a team of people and you teach them, we're going to do something that's not related to the software that you're making or the fire that you are fighting. I need to pick a better example that I know more about, but you teach them that skill independently of listen to each other, hold space yourself and give space to others. That feels like something that could generalize to work outside of just the creative writing as well.
Yes, absolutely. And that is my goal with my current doctoral research project, is to figure out these links, because I think something magical happens, Daniel, in the creative writing workshop, and I want to figure out a way to describe this more scientifically, rigorously, all these words that people want, with evidence. But what I know from my personal experience, particularly when I deliver memoir workshops, so this is when people talk about their life writing, nonfiction, when they are given space to share an answer to a prompt, or to read a little bit of their writing, or to talk about their experiences. And this has to be managed very carefully, but when it happens, the energy in the room changes and the level of listening is different, because you have to listen in a way to ask questions that are respectful, but questions that challenge, questions that encourage as well. And it is.
So can you give us an example of that?
So maybe a creative writing prompt in that class might start with, make a list of some of the things that you are most proud of in your life, or tell me where did you come from. And these are really big questions. So I could tell you, well, actually I grew up in this really small town in Worcestershire, or I could tell you, well, I came from these experiences that happened to me when I was traveling, or I came from a single mother, or I came from, we start to get to deeper levels, and people's responses to these questions are so different. And when you listen to them, and when people feel like they can share it, that it's safe to share some of these things, and you are moving beyond the realm of, oh, you're just a person in this class doing it with me, and you see them as, gosh, you're this whole person with this whole story, and all of these things have happened to you that have made you who you are and have brought you to this point, and you have so much experience and insight. And if we relate this back to teams, I want to see you as more than the person that fixes this bug in the software. I see you as this incredible story that has evolved and developed, and I want to relate to you in a deeper way. And I want you to know that I still respect you, but I understand you and I empathize with who you are, because I know more about your story.
And I might be able to handle the things I found difficult about you a bit more if I see you as that whole person. A lot of navigating team stuff is conflict, and is, I want to say that to that person, but they might blow up, or I don't like the way they do this, and we form all sorts of stories. And it sounds like this is a really powerful way of inviting more of that human, so that I can collaborate better with them. Because for me, in my agile context, there's always a question of, well, it's nice that we see each other as whole humans, and that feels good, but does that help us collaborate more? Does that help us solve our organizational goal? Like, if you're going to the management and asking for some money to go on a workshop or something, it doesn't need to just feel good. It needs to help the team be better. And I think that's what's so nice here, is that in the process of discovering someone's story, you might become a better collaborator with them, and you might be able to unlock more, to reduce barriers to teams working well together.
Yeah, and this is my challenge, is to figure out through my research how I can prove these links, because I've seen the magic happen. I've seen how strangers come together in a 60-minute class, even online, and they leave as friends, and they want to support each other and know more about each other. And it's figuring out how we translate this into practical tools for a team. Not just, oh yeah, I think you're a cool person and we'd like to go for coffee after this, but actually, no, I can work better with you because of this, and it's going to make our team stronger because of this.
You must have seen some interesting stories of workshops that started out with a bit of difficult feeling and a bit of that, and then resolved there. Do you have any that come to mind that you could share?
So part of this work is that it's really confidential. So it's hard to talk about some examples, because the way that I would create a writing workshop, and the way that, it's interesting, is this to ask you if this is what you do within your workshops, to have a couple of ground rules, or the way that we deliver the workshop to make it feel safe. And again, this is part of my research, is trying to really define these, and it changes with each group, so that they have to have some role in creating this space as well. But developing a set of boundaries which are agreed by the whole group. Having a board, a piece of paper, things we don't know board, things that we will find out later together. So it's okay to ask really difficult questions and we'll find out later. Every person also has to have the right or the ability to not participate, to not answer, to say, please don't, I don't want to share this piece of writing with you. And that's really important to help us to feel safe. There also has to be a lot of mirroring involved with the person delivering the workshop, and they have to take risks too. So if I ask a really difficult prompt or, ask people to share their writing, I have to be willing to share something of myself too. I have to be able to say, well, this is my answer. This is, I'll go first. Don't worry, we're in this together. So there's that idea of you not doing it to the people. You're in this together. You're doing it with them. So there's quite a few ways that we sort of have to set the scene for this. So is that the sort of thing that would happen in your workshops as well?
Yeah, it's sparked off a million different questions there, because when I run a workshop with a team, there's often a focus on some sort of outcome that sits between the team, but it doesn't belong to any particular team member. So, for example, if I'm running a workshop on how to use the Scrum framework or how to give better feedback, often the outcome there is something that the team can go away with and use. Or I run a ways of working workshop, or I run something like that where there's an output or there's an outcome that everyone can get involved in. We will work differently after this, or we will give each other feedback differently. Sometimes it is an individual thing. I will learn how to give better feedback, and then that's my own benefit. And in order to create that space, there's a tension that you sometimes have to navigate, which is, on the one hand, participation has to be freely given and not extracted from someone, and things like that. And then you get people's best ideas, and you know that when someone contributes something, it's not just to impress their manager, and it's because they want to. But on the other hand, if you have a team workshop, and let's say 9 out of 10 people are really excited to be there, and one of them is like, well, I'll go if you're doing it, but I'm not, like, this isn't my favorite thing in the world, they kind of still have to go. And you can't just choose, like, well, I'm just going to not show up and not be a developer today, or not be a firefighter today, because, like, that's not my truth, when the thing that we're talking about is some really important issue in the work that you need. So how you can, in my work, that's the tension you have to navigate. Like, some of the people really want to be there, some of them are like just about consenting, some of them wouldn't consent and they think that they have to go there or they'll be sacked or something. So how do you create a space where that's possible, and also get the creativity and also the participation, whilst also respecting that, like, yeah, it's not a freely chosen thing that everyone's coming to often from there. That makes it sound like my workshops are these, like, horrible, oppressive things, but I just know that, 95% of the participants will be, like, really excited to be there and think it's brilliant, and some of them will be like, yeah, another work meeting that I have to show up to, and there's no real way of articulating it that won't still have that resonance in their mind.
Yes. And this is just the truth of a team, isn't it? It's just how teams are, and it's tricky and it's not easy. This is the parts of my research that I know I'm going to find really interesting and difficult, and I'm working on figuring out the best answers. From my experience, this is where and creative writing isn't just about life writing, but this, what I think is the most relevant in these situations, is when we're talking about the personal in these professional places. So yes, there's people that maybe don't want to participate, but if somebody is sharing something that feels really true to them and is personal, you can't turn away from that. You can't disengage. Okay, maybe you don't ask follow-up questions, you don't really want to be there, but when people tell stories, we listen. This is how information has been passed down forever. So actually, we are forced to listen in a way, and I think that's a good thing, because even if you're then not ready to engage in that and you're just there, presenteeism, you have to be there. At least you're, again, going back to this idea of empathy, of understanding the other people in your team more, and maybe it opens a door, maybe it shines a little bit of possibility on the fact that they could re-engage into that team as a group of people working together on something, not just people with job roles that need to get something done. Yeah, but this is one of the one of the problems that I haven't got a really good answer for you yet, Daniel. And I'm hoping that my research into this will give us some answers, but I don't, it all goes into how people work as well and team dynamics. And maybe there isn't an answer to some of these things. The point of it is we can't force people. They have to have this option to pass. And yeah, I don't know. I don't have a better answer. Not yet.
I think that's yeah. I mean, there's so much of the more I do my kind of work, the more I realize it's about finding balances between extremes. And it's very rare to have a team where, literally everyone all the time and every role in the organization is just like absolutely psyched every single day to sometimes you like show up because you know that you need to, and that's normal. And I listen to podcasts and read things about these like Silicon Valley startups, and everyone's all like motivated by everything all the time. And then I reflect on my experiences in the places I've worked, and there are some teams that are like that and they're brilliant, and there are some teams that are like that and then they shift, and then one person has something going on at home and they're distracted a bit, and then there are other teams where they're still like getting shit done, but it's not quite as fully immersed emotionally as some of the other ones. And like that's all work, that's all within scope of people who we can help by bringing them together and helping them articulate themselves in front of each other and help them collaborate better. And yeah, I'm interested, like it's a podcast about agility and cognitive science, and the relevance of creative writing to that for me sits across those different areas of like the psychology aspect of cognitive science, like the human experience and how creative writing can impact that. And there's the sort of, you mentioned we've been telling stories for a long time or forever, and there's the anthropology side of that, and what culturally does it mean for us to tell our stories, and what sort of modes do we engage in when we do that. And there's the linguistic side of cognitive science as well, which the writing and the crafting things into words and practicing with that also is forms of cognition. And I love the idea of giving the team a whole other mode of cognition to be together with and to practice and to share with, and to become a better team, to become more high performing.
Yes. And there's even just really simple, practical activities that you can do to engage with creative writing just to help you warm up or cool down as a team, or just to try and see a problem differently. So I love that you've described it as all of these different elements, which it is, but also to bring it back to your audience and just some practical tools for them to take away. Creative writing can do that. It can just offer you a way to open up the day with a nice simple activity, to bring in a bit of joy, to close the day with some really nice reflection and lessons learned. So it's all of these wonderful things, but it's also just this little practical tool you can have in your pocket to use with your teams.
So let's say I am turning up to work and I have a team that are under my influence in some way, either because I'm a member of that team or I'm a manager or a coach or whatever. What are some simple, out of my back pocket creative writing tools and techniques that I can use to inject a little bit of creativity and joy into that team?
Okay. Really, really simple one. Monday morning, everyone's a bit tired, not had enough coffee, but we want to be quick because we need to get on with things. Grab everyone together, or if it's on the Teams call, whatever, just pop a timer on for 60 seconds, only 60 seconds. And I want you to write me a list. Lists are a great way to engage our brain with creativity. We have to push ourselves to get at least 10 things on the list because we don't want to be stuck on that awful number 7. We've got to push ourselves further. And I want you to write me a list about the things that bring you joy. But you have to be really, really specific. So not just my dog or, my husband, but the way that the wine sounds on a Friday, that glug when you pour it into the glass. That noise brings me a lot of joy. Or my dog, not just my dog in general, but when I come down in the morning and I can hear this bang, 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 bang of her tail on the door to her little crate before I've even got down the stairs. So writing is, for it to be engaging, it needs to be specific. So we're really trying to bring out the specifics. But when we focus on these things as well, it increases the joy that we have experienced because we are being specific. And that's just a 60-second task. Just write a list. And then we go around and we just share some joyful things. We get to know about each other. Who doesn't like to talk about things that bring us joy? That's a really nice, quick thing. But then how we take this further and how we can stretch our creativity muscle is to say, okay, pick one thing on the list and expand it for me for 3 minutes. So engaging in free writing is a really great creative writing tool for stretching that creativity. But also what that teaches us is to not fear the blank page. So just writing, even though we don't know what we're going to say, just trusting that we will have something to say. But if not, writing, this is stupid, I don't know what to write. Laura, why make me do this activity? I hate it. There's only so long you can write that for before you have to come up with something else. And I think, again, this not only stretches that creativity muscle, but it sort of teaches us to develop ideas, to generate something more, and to trust in that process of emergence. And then we go around and share some of our experiences. You don't have to share what you've written, but just, did you take anything from it? Did you find anything unexpected? Okay, now let's focus on work. Let's think about one thing that we can find joy in our work today, for example. So just a really, what's that, 5-minute activity to start the day in a really nice, joyful way.
There's two particular elements of that I really love. So one is the noticing element of that, and the other is the list generation. So when I facilitate a workshop, there's a particular kind of meeting that exists in Scrum, but it's also spread more into the agile world, which is the retrospective. And the retrospective is a meeting where you look at the way that the team is working together and try and find things to inspect and adapt and to change. So you sit with your team and you say, what happened in the last 2 weeks that you liked, that you didn't like? What frustrated you? What's working well? What's not? And the most frustrating thing for me as a facilitator is when I say, okay, the prompt question is one thing that you thought was working well and one thing that you think isn't working well. Everyone has to put one item in each of these boxes. You have to. It doesn't matter if it's nonsense. You just have to write something. And I've got a team of 6 people, and I see 3 Post-its in one and 4 in the other. And there's people that just sat there, and because I assume they don't have the tools, or they don't have the confidence, or they don't to just write stuff down and to get that out of their minds. And I've got no doubt that they have insight that if we could access it would be really helpful for us. But there's something that stops them being able to write it. And that's the list writing is part of that. Maybe they're worried about writing the wrong thing. And our education system encourages not writing the wrong thing, right? Like, if every time I write something down, it's going to be marked. Well, I don't want to write something that's stupid, so I'd rather write nothing. And there's that element. But then there's also the noticing element. Maybe that person hasn't noticed anything because they haven't been paying attention in that exquisite way to the glug of the wine or the tapping of the dog's tail. And it sounds like that exercise can help noticing. And by noticing the specifics of that, you could say, well, now, how was that meeting? No, specifically, how was it? Like, what did you like about it? Tell me more about what you liked about that. Like, be really precise about it. Like, I like the way that person gave me feedback. Like, brilliant. That's something that we can talk about. And it's a hook into being able to talk about those experiences together.
Yes, that's wonderful. I'm so glad you picked up on that, because great writing is about noticing. It's about really picking up the details, the nuance. And I think that's where so many stories are. So many people think it's the big things that happen to us in life, but it's actually noticing those small things and the incredible beauty in those small things. So if I'm allowed a small plug here about my book that I wrote about noticing our life and documenting those memories, that would be great. But I also wanted to expand on this with another small practical tool that you can take away. So I do a lot of ghostwriting. I write a lot of memoirs. So this is not spooky stories, ghostwriting in the voice of somebody else.
I had that pun in my head, and I was like, don't say it, don't say it, don't say it, don't say it. So I'm glad that you maybe saw my eyes being like...
No, I used the cliche there, even though we're not supposed to use cliches, but it sort of expands on what you said about the specifics of noticing, but actually ghostwriting is also about listening. So maybe an activity that you could expand on is interviewing a team member, making notes or recording the conversation, just doing it for 4 or 5 minutes about a specific problem at work. Or I'm trying to think of these agile team contexts, and it's not something I'm really experienced in, but in a team.
So don't worry, it could be any. Let's not get hooked into the
something you're struggling with at work, or you're a task. So you interview them, ask questions, And then as a ghostwriter, your job is to really listen to the words that they use, the way that they speak, when they maybe take a pause, some of the unique language that they use as well, or the tone in their voice, and to translate that and to show true understanding of what they have shared with you by turning that into the written word. So you could do this in a team scenario. This is what I'm struggling with. The interviewer asks questions, or the ghostwriter. They then transform this into, we can call it a mini story or a couple of paragraphs, and then sharing that with the person, checking in. Is this how you feel? Does this sound like you? Is this true of your experiences? Am I really gaining an understanding into what you are struggling with in this scenario, this problem that we need to fix? And just stepping into their shoes, stepping into their experiences of that problem can give you a different perspective then, and hopefully a deeper understanding. So just another short task that you can do to, even build rapport between each other, but just to gain that deeper understanding of that experience to maybe help them solve that problem.
Should we try that now?
Yeah. I mean,
okay.
Let's go for it.
Okay, I want to be the I've been interviewing you today, so I'm going to ask you to be my ghostwriter.
Okay.
That means I have to think of a problem, right? So go on, take us through the exercise. How would it work?
Okay, so let's start with what we've been talking about, shall we, Daniel? So tell me, what is the most joyful thing about the work that you do?
The most joyful thing about the work that I do is when I can change someone's perspective and they go, oh, that thing that's been happening, there's a pattern there that I hadn't quite realized, and there's causality, and I can do something about that pattern, or there's something in me that is contributing to some conflict in my team and I can actually have control over that. Maybe I should facilitate differently, or maybe I could use a different tool. Maybe I should shut up and not try and interrupt everyone all the time, or not try and have the cleverest answer in the room. And when I can see that moment where it twigs for people, I think that's the most joyful thing for me. I get to see I helped someone gain some insight into the problem that they're facing, the team that they're dealing with, and then maybe themselves and the way that they are at work.
And so where do you see that spark happen? That change, that ideation, that flip in perspective. How does that make you feel?
It makes me feel... I feel a bit emotional about that. It feels really like there feels like a moment of connection between you and that person where you have helped them. You've seen something in them that they may not have seen in themselves, and they've given you that trust to be able to share that back to them. I can reflect back to someone that they maybe are trying to solve problems where they need to let the team solve problems. So it feels like a real, I don't know, there's a feeling of connection, there's a feeling of trust and a bit of vulnerability there.
And do you feel like anybody has seen that in you and has called that out for you?
I can think of some times where that's happened, feedback I've got about when I've done things well, or when I've done something I'm proud of and someone reflects back to me and says, that thing you did, that was good, all the other way around, where someone goes, I think you needn't have done that, or you could have left a bit more space there. And I'm trying to think though. It's happened when I've done it. It's happened in a team where I was a contributor. I wasn't the sort of coach or the scrum master, and I definitely over egging certain bits and taking things very personally. And the description I was given was you're like a dog with a bone about this certain thing. And that person helped me see that, when it comes to some issues, I get completely I at that time could get completely locked in on them. And I think I still have that pattern. But I think about that now whenever I'm in a meeting or in a team setting and I'm really not letting something go. I think dog with a bone. Do I want to be like that right now? Oh, maybe not. Maybe I need to let go of this a bit.
Okay. So I could keep asking you questions about this and dig
Yeah,
further. And this is one of the great things about interviewing within ghostwriting is we're really trying to get to the heart of what makes a person tick, of what makes you who you are. And for me, the way that you talk as well is so visual that I would want to bring that into the writing too. You use your hands a lot, when you're really passionate, you gesticulate and you smile when you talk. And when you talk particularly about seeing that thing in someone, that change, and about you being part of that as well, you see how your eyes light up and you see how the eyes go wide and you're smiling at me and even you said that you felt that emotion as you wanted to talk about this. So I would love to ask you more about that. Where does that emotion come from? And dig deeper into where that comes from. So we get this deeper understanding of you. And so we can write this story of Daniel's joyful stories of change. Okay, of how you listen, of how you pull these things out of people, just as we try and do from you. So I would then try and create all of this into a little paragraph, almost of what does Daniel find joyful about work? So yes, this would be your joyful stories of change and talking about how you do that as well, but bringing in the physicality, the words, the emotion, and trying to craft that into a little story. So I can't turn it into a story now because I use my words to do that in a written format. But can you see how it's looking at not just what you said, but okay, well, what's the motivator behind that then? So this is what brings you joy, but why in particular? And then where does that come from? And how do you show that as you talk about it? And then, yeah, turning that into a story, but trying to understand that about you and where you come from and why you act in that way. And then just testing it, you know. So, Daniel, this brings out emotion in you. Why is that? And then you can have further questioning with that person. But I think it's the transition of of listening and talking to words that is where the power comes in then of ghostwriting, of checking in and saying, did you really understand that? Or no, Laura, you didn't get that right. That's not how I think or how I feel. But using that as a tool at work.
Mm. Yeah, it's fascinating. I love the role that you play in that is a very specific one. You're not like my manager or my friend or my this. You're my interviewer. You're my ghostwriter, which means that you give yourself a very specific shaped job. And I can just see myself gesticulating with my hands, which is a great quality for a podcaster who's only doing audio to have a really visually expressive experience. Trust me, anyone that's listening to this, you're missing out on 95%.
They are missing out. But it would
We
then
should
be the
do
job
videos.
to figure out, well, how do we show this excitement on the page instead of just telling, Daniel's waving at me with his hand. How do we communicate that enthusiasm through the words, through showing this, through the feeling as well? That it's looking at that in this context as a tool to understand the people that you're working with and checking in with
Yeah.
them.
And also to give the person who's doing the interviewing, who is not a professional interviewer, presumably, to give them an opportunity to play in a different mode, right? The game you're playing now, you win if you act like a successful Guardian journalist interviewing someone, or a successful ghostwriter or whatever, trying to get to the root of someone's experience. And that might be clumsy, that might be messy, but in the process of doing that, you didn't tell me what I should do next, or like how that'd be great. You'd be great for a career in blah blah blah. Your job is just to ask questions, and I think having a game that lets people play in those different modes is really important. So if I was running that as a workshop, give me some like really specifics, like how would that activity work? I've got a group of 10 people, and we want to do the ghostwriting activity.
So maybe it would be more helpful to be specific with the prompt. So it would be creating a story, Daniel's memoir of what went wrong in this task at work. What, Daniel's highs and lows in his career, or, giving a really specific parameter for the story that you are then going to write about that person. So, what story of what you're really good at work, what are your skills, or trying to make it really relatable to the end product. What are you trying to achieve, and how can this help you as a tool to do it? So that's in the non-fiction setting, but you can also look at using fiction to help you in some things. So thinking about maybe, your customer or the problem as a story that you are trying to write or that you're trying to solve. So look at using storyboarding or thinking about how you solve problems in this creative way of telling a story, whether this is how you then pitch something to the client or just as a team, how you play around with it. So if we think about a story in its really basic form, a story is about a character, and a character is somebody who wants something and overcomes conflict to get this goal, this thing that they want at the end. So is that your customer? Is that your product? That's the story. What are these conflicts? Are these things that you solve as a business, or are they things that your customer will face? And how can you write this creatively? Maybe you decide to write it as some sort of murder mystery crime story, or maybe you do it as a Lord of the Rings masterpiece of the storytelling that you create, but just messing around with different solutions and different obstacles and how you frame them can also be quite fun. I mean, is storyboarding something you do anyway within teams?
Just so, what if someone hasn't heard of storyboarding? I have an image of it, but I'm not sure it's the right one. Like, what do you mean by storyboarding in this context?
So I would see storyboarding as mapping out some of the key scenes that happen within the story. If you're writing a children's book, storyboarding would be mapping out the different pages and what happens to the character along the way. So just simply breaking down the key things that happen and defining them. Some people would even draw them out as an image. I'm not an artist. I don't do pictures in that way, but my storyboards would be, okay, this is this key scene, then this happens, and we might use some formal tools to help us do this. So one of the main ones we would use is the hero's journey. I don't know if you've heard of the hero's journey before.
For both of my listeners that may not have heard of the hero's journey, what is it?
So the hero's journey, I'm going to make sure I get this right, because it's actually based on a lot of history. I'm just going to Google it here so I get it right. I think it's Joseph Campbell. Yeah, it's Joseph Campbell. But it's based on...
I need a producer on hand. Just be like,
fact check.
Joe Rogan's got Jamie. Hey, Jamie, get the hero's journey.
Yeah, Joseph Campbell wrote the book, but it's actually based a lot on mythology. So our character goes through different stages when they're on a quest in the story. So you could think about this as well when you think about solving problems for a customer and how they go through a customer's journey. But this is actually in the story, the different stages our character goes through to get what they want. So they embark on this journey, and maybe there are specific stages, but thinking about the first one being an inciting incident. So what kicked off this story? What made them start into this adventure? And how can we use that? So that could be, for a customer or a team, it could be a problem that you're trying to solve, but it has to be a really big problem that you're trying to solve. Or it could be an ask, because a customer asked for something to be solved. And so our character moves through this journey. They might meet a guide along the way, which can be really useful, which helps them. So maybe that's part of where your role comes in as a coach, that guides them through. That as they're moving through this journey, they get to different stages. I think the middle stage is the dark night of the soul. So when things get really, really bad and they've reached this point of no return, they can't go back to the way that the old world was. They just have to keep going, but things are looking really bad and we think a character might die. And you can see this happen in stories, but death looks differently. So it might not be die. It might be that actually their whole world ends in a certain way, but then because of this guide, because of the things they've learned, because of who they've become, because of the journey that they've been on, how they've changed, they continue to move through these challenges, and then they have a breakthrough, they succeed, and they come back to this place, but they're a different person. They've returned from this journey, but they're not who they were when they set out on this journey. So maybe thinking about that in the sense of your customer's journey through a product or a problem, or just having fun. Like, you can get these set stages of the hero's journey and you can map out, okay, well, what if this happened? And that's a really powerful question to ask in creative writing, but also as a team. What if we did this? what good would come of it, what bad would come of it, how can we make things worse for our character is a question we often ask in creative writing because we want things to be really hard for them. So maybe flipping that for a team, instead of saying how can we make this harder, we could say, well, what problems could come of this? What can't we see? What are our blind spots? What could go wrong? And how can we try and come up with solutions before it happens to mitigate it? And then as we come back and we've been through this extraordinary period of change, I think you're thinking about agile, change is inevitable, isn't it? So really thinking about, well, change is so critical for characters in creative writing. Whether you're writing non-fiction or fiction, you have to show change. You have to show this journey. So having that as part of your team storyboarding of what has to change or what has changed or how can we change to reach this goal that we want to reach, or this character's goal to get to the end of the story. If that makes any sense whatsoever.
So that makes too much sense. I've got too many different directions I want to take now. So there's, on the one hand, like the idea of when we sit as a team and we work out, well, what's the problem we're trying to solve and how do we do that? We, in a way, are creating a work of fiction, right? We say, I am running some sort of service. Let's say I'm a nurse or I'm a multidisciplinary medical team. I've got patients that are going to come in and they're going to interact with the service at this point, then I'm going to give them these drugs and I'm going to stick this tube in them and I'm going to take them through this assessment. And there's a certain, that's what the field of service design is about, right? Mapping out those stages and working out what happens. But in a way, when we design that from the beginning, you could see that as creating a work of fiction. I'm creating a fictional world in which all this stuff happens. What does it feel like for that human? And the idea of using stories is fascinating there, because stories and metaphor, non-rational language, it carries with it so much, it's laden with all this extra meaning that I don't have to specify, right? So if I say Laura sat in her room at home talking to me on the laptop or whatever, there's so much information that is dense in that we can assume that there's not a fire, right? And we can assume that you're probably not with a bunch of other people, and we can also assume that you feel roughly at home or safe or whatever. There may be all these other layers added in, and when we try and do that fiction writing work of designing services, designing products, designing things for our users, we have to do it in a way that takes into account all the unspecified elements of what's happening for that person at that time, right? So for the firefighter story, when you say your user is at home, we actually assume there probably is a fire. Whereas if I say to a patient that's in some outpatient appointment, we assume that they're not on fire. Some crass distinction like that. But we need to find ways of articulating all that value, all that background, let's say. And stories are the perfect vehicle for that. They are the human way of articulating unspecified things in a way that lets you assume them and takes you there on that. So there's that one element of it. I feel like I could just blare about this. So I'm going to ask this question at some point and be a better interview host. But the other element of it is if I'm a coach and I'm trying to help someone on their own hero's journey or their own story. So I sometimes will help other Scrum Masters or other Agile coaches or other managers to think about how they manage their teams or how they facilitate or how they teach or things like that. And I can see them as being on their own hero's journey, right? Maybe I'm the guide, or maybe I'm the Knight of Darkness or whatever. But allowing them to go on that journey and maybe helping them tell that story about themselves or helping them tell that story about their team so that they can encapsulate it all together. Fascinating.
I think just the story of a team itself is so exciting, isn't it? Having a task of write the story of your team. What does it look like? What do you wish it looked like? And how do you get there? What's those difference between what it is and how you want it to be? And just even using the word story gives us so much freedom to play, to think differently, to have that new perspective. And I love what you said about using it I wrote down here, customer profiles, that idea of creating this customer, but actually you could create a character, this person who has a full backstory, who isn't just a 2D character, they're 3-dimensional, they have they're a real person, you know, like we talked about with this story, this rich history, these experiences, and creating them as real through characterization could then help the way that you deliver a service or a product, because it's not just this make believe thing. You've really taken into account this full backstory of a character, but who is a real person.
Yeah. And the agile world, or the user-centered design world, does this well, I think, because it has this idea of user story mapping or persona mapping, and both of those things. So persona mapping is where you say, I'm not just making this service I'm not just designing this phone app for generic human with specified list of needs. It's for Lucy, who is a graphic designer, and she lives in London, and she's got kids, and she's busy, and she's this, and she loves to go to listen to folk music on the weekend. And that story or that human thing helps me design a service, and I go, well, how would Lucy experience that? Given what I know about Lucy's life, and Lucy might be based on a real person or might be a fictitious thing, that can help me be more human-centered in the way that I design the experience. And then on the other side, like this sort of agile teams who might be building the stuff or writing the software, ideally the agile teams are also involved in the persona creation, but that's maybe for another time. Let's say the other half of the work, and you're actually building the stuff, is putting it into stories that you want to make true. So we have this idea of user story mapping, where you say, my product is not a list of features, a button that does this and a website that does this. You talk about a user story and you say, I want my user to be able to achieve something that's important to them. What's the work that I have to do to make that possible? And we have this format where we say, as a user to my website, I want to save my work. I want to submit my application for this job. And you go, so that I can get the job, or so that I can progress with my work, having saved it, or whatever. And then my job as the team is to take that and say, right, how do we help my user, Lucy, to achieve her overall goal of getting the job of her dreams by submitting her application? Well, I need to add a submit button, and I need to make that easy to navigate and all those other things. But all the mistakes that I might make along the way, it's easier to avoid them if you're keeping that bigger picture of what's the story that we're trying to achieve here. And I think user story mapping has become a technical term, like, which user story is this? And then you end up with user stories that are like, as a database, I want to be 5 times faster so that it's cheaper to run me. And like, that's not a story. That's a nice technical requirement to have. But we've sort of lost what a story is, I think, amongst the agileese type lingo that we pick up in workplaces where lots of the same people talk to each other all the time.
Yeah.
So I think this is really, that's why I'm enjoying about this conversation, is taking these words that are familiar and taking them back to, what does this actually mean?
Yes, and that actually helps us get better results, because even in your example there, you talked about almost this idea of a universal truth, which is something we use when writing memoir or life writing. So Lucy, it's not just about filling out this application form. She wants to get the job of her dreams, because a universal truth around that, which is something that generally we all agree to be true, is we all want fulfilling work, or we want work that feels like it's our dream job or whatever. So you're actually telling a story then that is exciting, it's going to have challenges, but most importantly, it's meaningful. So then we can really engage in the work that we're doing when we believe in that story and we believe in the universal truth of the story. And it becomes more than just a story then. It actually is about real people.
Yeah. I think that's the, when stuff goes wrong is when we abstract away from the real person element of our work. My job here is to help this user achieve an important goal. I do that by writing automated tests in the blah, 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 blah. Or I do that by injecting them with drugs because I'm hopefully a qualified medical professional, or whatever. But it's overall that, what's that goal? When we abstract away and we focus on the micro, we end up doing stupid things that get in the way of the overall goal in the interest of trying to like fulfill the specific abstraction. And that's what, when we do this facilitation work, this workshop work, this working with teams, that's the thing that when you have a team that talk in those terms, well, how's that going to help my user to do my thing? Or how's that going to help my service user? Or how's that going to help my patient? How's that going to help my 999 caller to be more safe that day, that's when we are less likely to do a stupid thing that maximizes some local minimum. What's the word? A local maximum, but a global minimum, or something like that. You just need to find a better way of expressing that. Something that makes sense in a very small, little bounded context, but not overall. I need to do more creative writing so that I can say things like that more clearly. Yeah.
Well, even it's a great example, because even looking at the reverse of it, and when things have gone wrong, when it's a air quotes bad story, actually looking at it as a piece of fiction and then picking it in that way could be really helpful, because when we think about good stories in fiction, loads of stuff needs to go wrong. There needs to be a lot of plot, there needs to be a lot of challenges for that character. It can't be too easy for them. So maybe we then tell the story of what happened in a fictional way. This went wrong, this climax happened when it went really, really wrong, but now it's our chance for a denouement. I can't say it, it's a French word. I have
a denouement.
Denouement, thank you.
Denouement.
Which actually links back to the word unraveling. So we're unraveling all these knots our characters have gone through, and we want them to have a happy ending. So yes, things have gone wrong in your team and your agile project, and you're telling this story, but now's your chance to create some resolution and not what's happened, and then create a happily ever after based on the lessons that you've learned.
I remember a few years ago, I studied in a Jewish Talmudic seminary type thing, and one of the teachers was teaching us about how to read the Bible in a certain way, and they were asking about the question of this is such a tangent, but it's my podcast, it's fine. Whether the Bible was true, whether the story happened, and this teacher, who was brilliant, said if you read a story about a really famous Nobel Prize winning literary luminary who wrote, and the character stood at the door and they could not find their keys and they stood there in the rain, you'd be like, wow, what does it mean that he's in the rain and finding his keys and he's lost and he's locked out? And whereas when I'm stuck outside my house, I'm looking for my keys, and you don't look at that, you go, oh, that's annoying, and I found my keys and whatever. And our life experiences are pregnant with these meanings and these stories and these narratives that we could take out, and in a way, whether they're true or not, the Bible is irrelevant. It's there's a beautiful story that can be told there, and if we can help our teams go from the technical fulfilling of a role profile more towards telling or creating an amazing set of stories for themselves, for their organizations, for the beneficiaries of their work, that opens up avenues that aren't otherwise available. And I'd love to be in a team where they're thinking about, how do I help this user who is lost at their front door looking for their keys to have a meaningful resolution to that in a way that sort of helps them. Yeah. If I was being super ambitious and I had a whole away day with my team and I wanted to spend a morning of it doing something that informed by creative writing, let's say generic team that works together day to day, and they're having an away day and they're going to spend the afternoon looking at strategy and tactics and all that kind of stuff. But in the morning, they want to do something really team building. Can you design me a morning session that might that might give them something that has a flavor of what we've been talking about?
Oh goodness. Okay. So I'm going to cheat and start by using an example we've already shared. So I'd start with the list, joyful list, expanding that into free writing. And then I think what I would do is a letter writing task. So writing a letter to a colleague, and everybody gets someone, so it's nice and fair and nobody just gets all the letters. And these ones we are going to share with the colleague, and thinking about how we can be really authentic. And we'd be writing pen and paper, not on our laptops, and writing why we're really grateful for them, what they've taught us, what we've learned from them, why we're glad that they're part of the team. So spending some time doing this to increase gratitude, as we've talked about, and happiness as well. Saying nice things to other people through words can increase our own happiness. So it's somewhat selfish actually, but a really nice thing to do. So those would be our warm-up activities. And then I think what I would do next is some form of writing workshop, which would feel absolutely terrifying, I'm sure, but making sure everybody felt really safe and knew that they didn't have to read anything out loud, but always giving people the option. And I would
Would you
think
create that
about,
safety by your instructions, or how do you help those people not feel too attacked?
yeah,
To
so I would
participate?
make sure we had, so I set the prompt first, which would be to write maybe something that they're really proud of, or maybe the hardest day of their life, or the best day of their life. So giving people options helps create safety because they're not forced to write about this one thing.
Mhm.
We set the boundaries in the group that what we share is really confidential, that actually we have to be really careful even to ask or reminisce about it outside of this session, because maybe somebody shared it in the session, but they don't want to talk about it afterwards. So being really careful about how we follow up on things too. But I would instruct people to write about this topic for 15, 20 minutes, and then talk about it with a partner, not sharing anything yet, but just talking about it, going back, rewriting it, redrafting it, and then asking the group if anybody wanted to share it. But within that, we'd have our boundaries. We'd also say, of course, you don't have to share. And as a facilitator, I would share what I've written first as well. And when we share, most importantly, in this setting, what we wouldn't do is be giving feedback on the written content, so how it's written, how well it's written. What we would be giving feedback on is the emotion that it made us feel, or we would be giving feedback on how creative the idea was. We aren't actually critiquing on that critical written element because that wouldn't be fair on the time that we've been given. So it's really setting the boundaries in how we give the feedback, and it would be more positive and encouraging about perhaps have to be really careful because you could talk about the topic, but you're not necessarily going to talk about the person in this context. So, say I tell you this was the worst day of my life, this is what's happened. The last thing you want is someone to give you feedback and be like, oh, I feel so sorry for you. It's not about that. It's about, oh, that's such an exciting or interesting or difficult experience. I'm glad you shared that with us. So, there's that. Do you see the nuance and difference? It's you're sort of talking about the writing, the story, and of course, the person is central to that, but you're not critiquing the person within the story. So there has to be some separation of the person and story, which starts to get really complicated because, of course, we are our words, but we're not our words at the same time. So I think this would just be more of a let's get to know each other, let's encourage each other, but let's learn something new about each other that we didn't know before. So creating that space to share that thing, and then we would decompress, maybe do something that's not quite so heavy or not quite as hard to share as well, because these things can be really hard to share, but they can be so powerful. So it maybe end with some fun tasks. So one that I think is really nice is actually from lots of the fun ones I think come from spoken word poets or spoken word storytellers. So maybe watching a short example of a few. There's one that I really like called Matthew Dix, and he's told quite a few stories on The Moth, which is a storytelling podcast, but also does live events. And he has a great book, actually, which has lots of lovely examples. And one of his examples of how to create ideas or how to create something that might turn into a spoken word story is to use a table and create some really quick scenarios. So he would say, for example, using these words first, best, worst, and last. Okay, so that's your table. And then I'm going to give you some prompts. Maybe the group gets to decide these prompts, and we're going to come up with some stories about our lives and see if we can find some examples. So the keywords might be it might be kiss. So your first, best, worst, or last kiss. Maybe that's a bit too much for a work context. So maybe a toaster. Tell us about your first, best, worst toaster. And I've used that one before, and I've had some really interesting stories come up. Maybe it's about a pet or whatever, but just then breaking up with some really simple, fun prompts and playing around with some spoken word, which again helps us to practice presentation skills, communication, creativity. So that was my off-the-cuff plan of a half-morning team building workshop that's joyful, but we learn about each other, we empathize. Yeah.
Brilliant. I would attend. Nice. I love the idea of using like some of these tools, particularly in like prompts for retrospectives and things like that, oiling the gears of conversation. Yeah, tell me about your best toaster. For some reason, all the cognitive science writing and speaking I've done is theming around toast, so that could work as well. But it all comes together at toast.
Yeah.
And you were telling me earlier for breakfast you had scrambled eggs on toast, so
yeah,
it's all toast shaped.
I've got some good stories about toasters, I'm sure, buried somewhere.
Yeah. So we are coming to the end of our time together. Where can we find out more about you and your work, and also where would you recommend to our listener who wants to learn more about this topic?
Wonderful. So you can visit derbyshirewritingschool.com. You can learn more about my workshops, courses, workbooks, retreats. There's also a podcast on there, which I recorded with my dad. We've got 100 episodes. So if you're not sick of hearing my voice, you can head over to that podcast. On that website, you'll also find more about the ghostwriting that I offer and some of the books that I've written. And I'm really interested actually to hear, Daniel, from your listeners, your audience, if anyone is interested in sampling a workshop which is yet to be developed but will form part of my PhD, my doctoral research, looking at how we specifically use creative writing to develop teams. So thinking about cohesion and high performance, and I'm sure some of the activities we've talked about in some form will wiggle their way in there, but it will be lots of fun. So I'll share a link, which is an expression of interest form. If anybody wants to take part, it'd be great to have you on board. And what else did you say? Oh, if you're interested in finding out more. So what I will do is I'll send you the link to the Matthew Dix book, which I think is really interesting, especially if you want to think about storytelling in work in the sense of you being a speaker maybe or a presenter and figuring out how to tell better stories in that sense. Maybe I should have reread this book before I told the story of why I got into creative writing. But anyway, I will share that. It's a great book.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for coming on the show. There's one last element that I want to do, which I recorded an episode the other week with my friend Kerry, which this will probably come out before that one did. But one of the things we explored there was a micro retrospective at the end of the episode. So I wanted to ask you, how was this episode for you? What feedback do you have for me as an interview host for how I could do a better job in future?
How was this for me? Well, I wasn't 100% sure what to expect because I'm learning more about how the worlds that we work in intertwine. So I still feel like I'm at the beginning of this journey. So it's really nice to talk to you and listen to all of your experience. And I think you've done a really great job of knitting together the worlds that we work in and showing how relevant they are to your audience, but also you've been really kind and bought in to, the skills that I can bring into that world. So you've done a great job at that. I'm really grateful. Thank you. And I think, I don't know how we can improve as an interviewer, Daniel. I think I don't know. I'm not going to make something up.
This takes us back to the noticing bit. Were there any bits that felt a bit weird or a bit like harder to navigate for you that come up?
Talking about how we can translate ghostwriting without being able to write that down, that was really hard for me because the way that I process is through writing things down. It was a great example to begin to interview you, but I think I could have demonstrated that better by having time to just write down a short paragraph, which isn't practical in a podcast sense, but hopefully it gave an idea of how you can use that.
So I wonder if the lesson for me there is I could have asked you in advance, think of one really cool tool that you definitely want to use, and then let's make sure we have a way of working that into the episode in a way that works. Because I feel like I ended up springing that on you because it was cool and interesting, but maybe the the format of like how to do that and write it down interview wouldn't have worked and we would have had a different example instead. So that's that's really handy. I'm gonna make sure I incorporate that in future, because then that means that you can bring a tool that like works for the format and works well.
Yeah, it's hard sometimes because podcasts are great in the way that they organically happen and evolve. Sometimes you couldn't plan for things, and that's what makes it interesting, that there are things you can plan for. So maybe that would work in the future. Yeah.
Beautiful. Thank you very much for coming on the Agile on the Mind podcast, Laura, and hope to talk to you soon.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of the Agile on the Mind podcast with Laura Stroud and me, Daniel Susser. If you enjoyed this episode and you want to hear more, please subscribe to the Agile on the Mind podcast on any of your main podcast subscription services, or you can find my Substack at agileonthemind.substack.com. And if you subscribe for free, you'll get a weekly newsletter with cognitive science and agility ideas, podcasts, and more. Hope to see you next time on the Agile on the Mind podcast.